This is the reading selection 800 through 809, mostly about the Korean War. Korea is important politically because it's the only point of direct confrontation with the Soviet Union in Asia, but was not considered important militarily. So there's been some movement back and forth after World War II on what Korea wants to be themselves. And so North Korea attacks South Korea, and the South Korean army collapses, leading Truman to commit troops for Japan because they want to protect Japan from falling to communism. Plus, they don't want Korea to fall to communism either. The Soviet Union started boycotting the United Nations because of the things that the United Nations were doing that went against what they believed. The Security Council asked the United Nations, our Security Council asked the United Nations to help South Korea. So the Korean War is not a U.S. war, it's an official UN action led by the U.S. military. General Douglas MacArthur is the lead general in the war. Excuse me. So, the military conflict seesawed as first North Korea pushed American troops to a small toehold, and the American troops pulled North Korea. It's just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Here's the easy way to explain it, okay? So, North Korea invades South Korea and knocks them all the way back to here. We, instead of landing and hammering at South Korea this way, we land here and work our way back this way. At this point, we take all of South Korea and move towards North Korea. We ask Truman, MacArthur asked Truman if he can invade, making this an offensive war now instead of a defensive war, and he moves towards China. And Truman tells him not to get too close to China because he doesn't want to provoke China. Well, he does. The Chinese come in and push us all the way back down to here. And then an armistice is made and the war ends, making the 38th parallel right here the boundary. That's where, as we can see right here, it started in 1945 as the boundary, and when it ends, 1953 over here. Okay, so really all this fighting and people dying is for absolutely nothing. North Korea and South Korea are still separated by the 38th parallel. You can see why we really wanted to protect and supply South Korea because of Japan's proximity to Korea. Okay, this line right here is supposed to be a demilitarized zone, this area in between the South Korea and North Korea, but it's actually one of the most militarized zones in the world, with landmines on each side, and it's really rather interesting. And so South Korea remains a democratic ally of the United States, and North Korea remains communist and an ally of the Chinese as well as the Soviet Union. The war was a major factor in the Republican victory in 1952, and again, the armistice was signed in June of 53, like I was talking about earlier. Korean War is a preview of the Vietnam War. It helped legitimize the United Nations. It confirmed the ideas that the Soviets are trying to expand and stimulated our rearmament. Now, the next big thing happens on the home front. We've talked about the Red Scare before, following World War I. Now we're talking about the Red Scare and how it affects us in the 1950s during the Cold War and with communist Russia, the Soviet Union. After World War II, the Communist Party in the United States declined rapidly. Nobody wants to be a part of the Communist Party. Republicans used what's called red baiting as a campaign technique in 44 and 46, saying that majority of the Democrats and people in the government, there's communists around. And so what Truman does is he comes up with this loyalty program for federal employees. And they have to live in this state of fear because of they're afraid they might be outed as a communist even though they weren't. You had to take a loyalty oath. You had to answer questions, things you should not have to do. But it was implemented because of our fear. Again, going against our amendments. However, when we're in fear, that happens. The loyalty program resulted in 1,200 firings and 6,000 resignations. People would rather resign than answer these questions on the loyalty program. Congress develops HUAC, or the House Committee on Un-American Activities, in 1945. Its first thing it does is it launches an investigation into Hollywood, saying that Hollywood is full of communists. And what you have to remember is that the easiest way to manipulate people in the 1950s was through media, and that media was through the movies. 10 Hollywood figures refused to testify, and they went to jail in 1950. Others were put on what was called a blacklist, where they couldn't be hired. They just wouldn't be hired. Imagine spending your whole life doing something that you loved, and then all of a sudden, it's over. You can't work in that job anymore. So very scary. And it's a he said, she said. HUAC changed the politics of Hollywood from leaning left to more conservative. And then 1952, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee targeted diplomats, union leaders, professors, teachers, hoping to gather names of subversives, also to get people who have influence over other people. Remember, anybody that is teaching you or has influence over you can sway you to think about things in a different light, and can sway you to not do the right things. State legislators conducted similar hearings, and it's all about trying to find the communists. Here are the different things, the chart in your book about the Second Red Scare. In 1948, the Justice Department indicted the leaders of the American Communist Party, saying they were trying to overthrow the U.S. government. So they put the Communist Party on trial first. Then there's Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss held a State Department position. And a former communist who was a spy, and we flipped, his name was Whittaker Chambers, accuses Hiss of being a communist. Nixon came involved. There was a whole bunch of people involved. We could not prove that he sold secrets, that he was a spy. We did prove that he purged himself, meaning that he lied under oath. And again, we have some evidence, but we could never prove it. But he goes to jail for perjury. So first the Communist Party put on trial for trying to overthrow the government. Then Alger Hiss. Then Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They are admitted communists, and they were tried for espionage with little evidence. They are found guilty. People all around the world are appealing for clemency, aka just let them live in jail for the rest of their lives. But they ended up being executed for being spies. So these three court cases, or three subversion trials, as they're called, are really interesting. It shows how scared we were of communism, aka the Red Scare. Here's Nixon on the right as a younger man looking at evidence of spies and trying to come up with other spies in their committee in HUAC. Then comes old Joseph McCarthy. On February 9th, 1950, Senator McCarthy of Wisconsin said he had a list of 205 communists in our State Department. Well, in the later days, it changes. But he does catch some communists. Is it illegal to be a communist? No. But he's starting to get some claim to fame for saying that there are communists in our government, and there are. Again, he really doesn't have any evidence. It's like throwing mud at the wall. Some of it'll stick. You're going to get some. And he gets money for committees. He gets his 15 minutes of fame. We're still talking about him for these charges. But he makes a big mistake. In 1954, he attacks the U.S. Army in a Senate hearing that was televised. And basically what happens is that he gets an Army commander up there, and the Army commander isn't going to be bullied by McCarthy. And he just keeps telling McCarthy in no uncertain terms, prove it, sir. Prove that there are communists in the U.S. Army. Prove it, sir. Prove it, sir. And the American people see that he can't, and that he's a bully and he's a fraud. His popularity plummets. He's not reelected to office, and he dies of cancer not very many years later. But you can see, again, this shows that when we're in fear, we're going to believe a lot. Okay, this guy has years. Look, it says 1950, the beginning of 1950. For 4 years, he is able to go about and attack people, and you were afraid of being called out by him if you worked for the government, because it was just crazy. It reminds me a lot of the French Revolution, where they off with their head, off with their head. You're part of the Communist Party. I mean, you're a part of the. You're not for the revolution. Off with your head. And in this case, is you're not American. You're not for the. You're not for democracy. You're not for capitalism. You're a communist. Fire him. So, very interesting time in America. And here is McCarthy. You can see this guy right here is really amused. The subversive campaign called McCarthyism lingered. Legislation provided tools of repression and fear of communism, and it reached deep into American society. There are 4 factors that contributed to Americans' fears, and these are real factors. I'm not saying they're right, but this is what was going on at the time. The legitimate but exaggerated concern about atomic spies. Were there spies? Yes. Were they really causing a whole lot of problem for everyday American people? No, except for the fact that they might be able to pass on things about nuclear weapons to make more nuclear weapons. Number 2, an undercurrent of anti-Semitism and nativism. We don't like anybody else in America. We talked about why the Jewish thing. We talked about during the war why that happens, but also nativism. Number 3, Southern and Westerns resented the Eastern Ivy League elite. We aren't as good as them. We'll never be as good as them in their eyes, so we resent them. And then the 4th reason, and this is the biggest one out of all of them, is that the world's spinning out of control. That the next generation isn't going to have it as good as the generation before. And that's a scary thought. And that's all we have for 800 through 809.